They said Jackson Reed never showed mercy when collecting what he was owed. They said his eyes were as cold as the Montana winter, and his heart was colder still. When he rode up to the Miller homestead that October morning in 1897, everyone in Copper Valley knew why he'd come. $1,500. 6 months overdue, and a debt that would break the family who couldn't pay. But what he took from that desperate farm wasn't money. It wasn't land. It was her. And what started as the cruelest transaction would become the most unexpected love story Copper Valley had ever known. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frost came early to Copper Valley that year. By mid-October 1897, the aspens had already surrendered their leaves, and the morning air carried the sharp bite of winter's promise. The Miller farm sat on the eastern edge of the valley, where the land sloped upward toward the Bridger Mountains. Beautiful, unforgiving country that gave grudgingly and took freely. Sarah Miller stood at the kitchen window, watching the road. She'd been watching it for 3 days now, ever since her father had told her the truth. Ever since the color had drained from his face and his hands had trembled as he held the notice from Reed Ranch, payment due, 30 days past grace period, collection imminent. Her father, Thomas Miller, sat at the kitchen table now, his head in his hands. He was 47 but looked 20 years older, the kind of aging that happened not gradually but all at once, when a man realized he'd gambled everything and lost. "Papa," Sarah said quietly, turning from the window. "Maybe he won't come today. Maybe he'll come." Thomas's voice was hollow. "A man like Jackson Reed doesn't send notices. He sends one notice, and then he comes himself." That's what they say. Sarah had heard the stories. Everyone in Copper Valley had. Jackson Reed owned the largest ranch in the territory. 60,000 acres of prime grazing land, stretching from the valley floor up into the mountain meadows. His cattle operation supplied beef to mining camps across Montana and into Idaho. He employed 40 men, owned property in Billings, and held paper on half the farms in the valley. He was 31 years old and had never married. They said he didn't need anyone, that he was complete unto himself, hard, fair, ruthless when crossed. "How much do we owe?" Sarah asked, though she'd asked before. Somehow, hearing it again might make it less impossible. $1,500. Thomas's voice cracked. Plus interest. $1,640 total. Sarah's heart sank. They might as well have owed $16,000. The farm had barely produced $800 worth of crops this year. The early frost had killed the wheat before harvest. 2 of their milk cows had died from bloat. The chicken coop had been raided by a fox, and they'd lost 30 birds in a single night. They were drowning, and everyone knew it. "Why did you borrow from him, Papa?" Sarah had asked this before too, but she still couldn't understand it. Thomas looked up, and for the first time she saw tears in his father's eyes. "Your mother," he said simply. "The doctor said there was a specialist in Seattle who could help with the cancer. Said it would cost $1,000, plus travel, plus lodging. I thought if I borrowed the money, planted twice as much wheat, worked twice as hard." He trailed off. "She died anyway, and the crops failed anyway. And now they had nothing. The farm would be seized. The land would be forfeit. They'd be left with whatever they could carry on their backs, 2 people with nowhere to go, and winter coming fast." Sarah crossed to her father and put her hand on his shoulder. She was 23 years old, unmarried, with no prospects. The daughter of a failed farmer in a valley where success was measured in acres and livestock. She'd spent her whole life working this land, up before dawn to milk the cows, feeding chickens, mending fences, cooking, cleaning, washing, sewing. Her hands were calloused, her face sun-weathered. She wasn't the kind of girl men wrote poetry about, but she was strong, and she was her father's daughter. "We'll figure something out," she said, not believing it, but needing to say it. Anyway, Thomas just shook his head. The sound of hoofbeats came just after 10 o'clock. Sarah heard them first, the steady rhythm of multiple horses moving at a working pace, not hurried but inevitable. She froze at the stove, where she'd been stirring a pot of thin vegetable soup. Her father stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Stay inside," he said. "No." Sarah set down the spoon and wiped her hands on her apron. "If this concerns the family, I should be there." Thomas started to argue, then stopped. There was no point. She was all the family he had left. They walked out together onto the porch. 3 riders came up the dirt path that served as their road. The man in the center sat differently than the others, straighter, calmer, like someone who'd been born on horseback and never quite felt at home anywhere else. He rode a massive bay gelding, 17 hands if it was an inch, and wore a black coat over a dark vest, black trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Jackson Reed. The 2 men flanking him were clearly ranch hands, practical clothes, working horses, rifles, and saddle scabbards. They pulled up about 20 feet from the porch and stopped. The only sound was the creak of leather and the soft snort of the horses breathing in the cold air. Reed dismounted in one smooth motion. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean build of a man who worked his own land rather than just owning it. He removed his hat, and Sarah got her first clear look at his face, hard as she'd expected. Angular jaw, high cheekbones, dark hair cropped short. But his eyes surprised her. They weren't cold exactly. They were assessing, intelligent, the eyes of someone who saw everything and calculated its value in an instant. "Mr. Miller," Reed said, his voice low and even. "I believe you know why I'm here." Thomas stepped forward, his shoulders hunched. "Mr. Reed, I know I'm late with the payment. I've been meaning to—" "You're not late, Mr. Miller. Late was 3 months ago. You're in default." Reed's tone wasn't cruel, but it was absolute. "I've extended grace periods twice already. I can't do it again. Please." The word came out broken. "Just 1 more month. The winter wheat is already planted. And if the spring is good, you'll harvest in July. That's 9 months away. I'm not a charity, Mr. Miller. I'm a businessman. And this is business." Sarah felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. There was something infuriating about his calmness, his certainty, as if their desperation was just mathematics to him. "So that's it," she heard herself say. "You take the farm and we lose everything?" Reed's eyes shifted to her. She felt the weight of his gaze, measuring her the way he'd measure livestock at auction. "The terms were clear when your father signed the contract. Default means forfeiture. The land, the buildings, the equipment, all of it becomes property of Reed Ranch." "My mother died for this debt," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. "He borrowed that money to save her life. Is that the kind of business you're proud of?" Something flickered across Reed's face. It might have been annoyance. It might have been something else. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Miller. But sentiment doesn't change debt. Your father borrowed money he couldn't repay. Those are the facts." "The facts," Sarah repeated bitterly. "Is that all that matters to you? Facts and contracts and dollars?" Reed studied her for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "Because facts don't lie and contracts don't change their minds. Feelings do both." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. Sarah could hear her father's ragged breathing beside her, could see the 2 ranch hands shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension. Then Reed did something unexpected. He turned to his men. "Wait here." He walked toward the porch, climbing the 3 steps slowly. Up close, he was even taller than Sarah had thought, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. This close, she could see details, a scar along his left jawline, the calluses on his hands that matched her own, the way his dark eyes reflected something harder than mere coldness. It was control. "Complete, unwavering control, Mr. Miller," Reed said quietly. "May I speak with you and your daughter inside?" Thomas glanced at Sarah, confused. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. They went into the house, into the small front room, with its worn furniture and faded curtains. Reed didn't sit even when offered. He stood by the fireplace, hat in his hands, and looked at both of them. "I'll be direct," he said. "The farm is worth maybe $800 in its current condition. The debt is $1,640. Even if I seize everything, I'm still short. That's not good business? Then what do you want?" Thomas asked desperately. "I'll work. I'll pay you back however you want, whatever it takes." You're 47 years old with a bad back and no prospects. No offense, but you're not valuable enough labor to cover this debt. Reed's words were brutal in their honesty. However, I have a different proposal. He turned to look at Sarah directly. She felt her stomach drop. I need a wife, Reed said simply. Someone practical. Someone who understands ranch work. Someone who won't expect romance or softness or anything beyond a working partnership. His eyes stayed on hers. Marry me, Miss Miller. Become my wife. Come to Reed Ranch, and I'll consider your father's debt paid in full. The room went absolutely silent. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she'd just heard. You're offering to buy me? She whispered. I'm offering to marry you, Reed corrected. There's a difference. You'll have a home, security, comfort. Your father keeps his farm. Everyone benefits. Except me. Sarah's voice was rising now. I'm not livestock, Mr. Reed. I'm not a transaction. Everything is a transaction, Miss Miller. You work your father's farm every day. Isn't that a transaction? Your labor for shelter and food. This is the same thing, just with different terms. He tilted his head slightly. Or would you prefer I seize the farm and leave both of you with nothing? Thomas made a small broken sound. Sarah, you don't have to. 2 days, Reed interrupted. I'll give you 2 days to think about it. If you agree, we'll be married in Copper Valley on Saturday. If not, I'll return on Monday with the sheriff and a seizure order. He placed his hat back on his head. The choice is yours. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at Sarah. For just a moment, something in his expression softened, barely perceptible, but there. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I would treat you fairly. You'd want for nothing material, and I'd never raise a hand to you. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Through the window, Sarah watched him mount his horse with that same fluid grace, watched him turn and ride away with his 2 men flanking him, watched until they disappeared down the road toward the Reed Ranch. She turned to her father and saw him weeping, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs, and Sarah Miller realized that she'd already made her choice. She'd made it the moment Reed had spoken, because she knew her father couldn't survive losing this farm, couldn't survive losing the last piece of the life he'd built with her mother. She crossed to him and knelt down, taking his weathered hands in hers. Papa, she said softly, it's okay. No. He looked up at her with devastated eyes. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my mistakes. It's not a sacrifice, she lied. It's practical, like he said. A working partnership. She smiled even though her heart was breaking. And you'll keep the farm. You'll be okay. That's what matters. Thomas pulled her into a hug, holding her like he had when she was a little girl, and Sarah closed her eyes and tried not to think about what she was giving up. Tried not to think about the cold eyes of Jackson Reed, or the way he'd assessed her like she was just another asset to acquire. Tried not to think about the fact that in 2 days, she would become the wife of a man who saw everything in life as a transaction, and nothing as love. Outside, the frost was already forming on the windows. Winter was coming fast and merciless, and Sarah Miller was about to walk straight into its heart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 2 days passed like a fever dream. Sarah spent the first morning alone in her mother's old sewing room, staring at the dress that hung in the wardrobe, her mother's wedding dress, yellowed with age but still beautiful, cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Margaret Miller had been married in this dress 30 years ago, in a ceremony full of joy and hope and all the things a wedding was supposed to be. Sarah couldn't bring herself to touch it. Instead, she went to her own small closet and pulled out her Sunday dress, simple dark blue cotton, high-necked and practical. It was clean. It was respectable. It was honest about what this marriage would be. Thomas tried to talk her out of it 17 times over those 2 days. Each attempt broke her heart a little more, but she held firm. By the second evening, he'd stopped arguing and just sat with her in silence, holding her hand across the kitchen table as the sun set over the mountains. Your mother would have hated this, he said finally. Mama would have understood, Sarah replied. She was practical too. She married for love, and I'm marrying for survival. It's not so different. Sarah squeezed his hand. Papa, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't waste this. Don't let guilt eat you alive. Keep the farm running. Plant in the spring. Make this worth it. Her voice cracked. Please. Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. I promise. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Jackson Reed appeared at 9 o'clock sharp, alone this time, riding the same bay gelding. He wore a black suit, crisp white shirt and a string tie, formal but not ostentatious. When he dismounted, Sarah noticed he carried a small wooden box. She met him on the porch, wearing her blue dress, her hair braided and pinned simply. She debated wearing it loose but decided against it. This wasn't about beauty. This was business. Reed stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. His expression was unreadable. Miss Miller, Mr. Reed, are you certain about this? The question surprised her. She'd expected him to be coldly efficient, to hurry through the formalities. Instead, he stood there giving her one final chance to refuse. Yes, she said, because what else could she say? He climbed the steps and held out the wooden box. This was my mother's, I thought. You should have it. Sarah opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a ring, gold, with a small emerald surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was beautiful. It was also clearly expensive, the kind of heirloom that passed through generations. I can't accept this, she said automatically. You're about to become my wife. It's appropriate. Reed's tone was matter-of-fact. My mother wore it for 42 years. She'd want it to be worn, not locked in a drawer. Sarah lifted the ring from the box. It caught the morning light, scattering tiny green sparks. What was she like? Your mother? Strong, fair. She ran the ranch alongside my father for 30 years. When he died, she ran it alone until I was old enough to take over. Reed paused. She would have liked you, I think. She respected people who made hard choices. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her, and Sarah didn't quite know how to respond. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Somehow that made everything feel more real and more terrifying. The preacher is waiting in town, Reed said, returning to his businesslike tone. We should go. Thomas emerged from the house, wearing his own Sunday suit, his eyes red-rimmed but his jaw set. He'd made his peace with this, or at least convinced himself he had. He shook Reed's hand, a brief, awkward gesture, and then helped Sarah into Reed's buggy. Reed had brought a covered carriage rather than riding horseback, she noticed. A small consideration, but a consideration nonetheless. The ride to Copper Valley took 40 minutes. No one spoke. Sarah watched the landscape roll past. The farmland giving way to open range, the mountains rising stark and beautiful against the brilliant blue sky. This was the land Reed owned, the empire he'd built. She was entering his world now, leaving hers behind. The town of Copper Valley consisted of one main street with perhaps 20 buildings, a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a bank, a blacksmith, and a small white church at the far end. As they rode through, Sarah saw faces appear in windows, saw people stop on the boardwalk to stare. News traveled fast in small towns, and everyone knew what was happening today. She saw pity in some faces, curiosity in others. A few women looked at her with something like envy. After all, she was marrying the richest man in the territory. They didn't understand that wealth meant nothing when your heart wasn't in it. The church was simple. Whitewashed wood with a modest steeple and rows of plain wooden pews. Reverend James Holbrook waited on the steps, a portly man in his 60s with kind eyes and a nervous expression. He clearly wasn't comfortable with this arrangement, but had apparently decided not to refuse. Mr. Reed, Miss Miller, Mr. Miller. He nodded to each of them. Shall we proceed? They entered the church. It was empty except for 2 witnesses Reed had brought, his foreman, a grizzled man named Curtis Webb, and the ranch's housekeeper, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Dorothy Chen. Sarah had never met either of them, but they would apparently serve as witnesses to her marriage. The ceremony itself took less than 10 minutes. Reverend Holbrook rushed through the vows, as if speed might somehow make the whole thing less uncomfortable. Sarah heard herself repeating the words, to have and to hold, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, and they sounded hollow in her own ears. Beside her, Reed spoke his vows in that same even, controlled tone he used for everything. When Holbrook reached, "You may kiss the bride," Reed hesitated for just a moment. Then he leaned down and pressed his lips to Sarah's, brief, chaste, perfunctory. It was the first time he'd touched her beyond a handshake, and Sarah was surprised by the warmth of him. She'd expected him to be cold, but his lips were warm, his hand on her arm gentle. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then it was over. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Holbrook said, sounding relieved to have finished. "May God bless this union." Sarah wanted to laugh at the absurdity of asking God's blessing on a transaction, but she kept her face composed. Reed signed the marriage certificate in bold, confident strokes. Sarah signed beneath his name, Sarah Miller Reed. It looked foreign to her, like someone else's signature. Thomas hugged her tightly before they left, whispering in her ear, "You can still change your mind. We'll find another way." But they both knew there was no other way. Sarah kissed his cheek and pulled away, refusing to let herself cry. Tears wouldn't help anyone. The ride to Reed Ranch took an hour, heading northwest from town into the foothills. The property began long before the main house came into view. Endless fencing marking boundaries, cattle grazing in vast pastures, workers on horseback moving among the herds. Sarah had heard about Reed Ranch her whole life, but seeing it was different. This wasn't just a large farm. This was an operation, a business empire sprawling across the landscape like its own small kingdom. The main house appeared as they crested a rise, and Sarah's breath caught despite herself. It was enormous, 2 stories of whitewashed timber and stone, with a wide wraparound porch and large windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Outbuildings surrounded it, a massive barn, several equipment sheds, a bunkhouse for the workers, a smokehouse, and what looked like a separate cottage. "That's Mrs. Chen's house," Reed said, noticing her gaze. "She prefers her privacy. The bunkhouse holds 20 men, though only 15 are here during winter. Curtis lives in the cottage behind the barn." He was giving her a tour like she was a new investor rather than his wife. Sarah supposed that was accurate enough. They pulled up to the main house, and Curtis appeared immediately to take the horses. Mrs. Chen stood on the porch, her expression unchanged from the church, neutral, assessing, giving nothing away. Reed dismounted and came around to help Sarah down. His hands on her waist were firm but impersonal, steadying her as her feet found the ground. "Welcome to Reed Ranch," he said formally. Mrs. Chen descended the porch steps and gave Sarah a short nod. "Ma'am, I've prepared the guest room for you. Your trunk arrived yesterday." Her accent carried traces of Chinese, though her English was perfect. "Guest room," Sarah repeated, confused. Reed cleared his throat. "I thought you'd prefer your own space." "The master bedroom is mine. The guest room is across the hall. It's quite comfortable." Understanding dawned slowly. He wasn't expecting them to share a room, to share a bed. This really was just a business arrangement to him. Practical, civilized, separate. Sarah didn't know whether to feel relieved or insulted. She settled on relieved. "Thank you. That's considerate." "I'll show you the house," Reed said, gesturing toward the door. The interior matched the exterior's grandeur. Hardwood floors, high ceilings, furniture that was expensive but not ostentatious. Everything was clean, organized, masculine. The front room held a massive stone fireplace, leather chairs, and shelves lined with books, more books than Sarah had ever seen outside of a library. The dining room table could seat 12. The kitchen was enormous, with a cast-iron stove that must have cost a fortune and more cupboards than one household could possibly need. "Mrs. Chen manages the house staff," Reed explained as they toured. "There are 2 girls who come in daily for cleaning and laundry, Lucy and Emma, sisters from town. Cook comes at 5 each morning and leaves after dinner is prepared. You won't need to do any of that work yourself." It should have sounded like luxury. Instead, it sounded like he was telling her she'd be useless here. On her father's farm, she'd known her purpose. Every chore, every task, every responsibility. Here, she would be decorative at best. The guest room, her room now, was on the second floor, facing east. It was larger than her entire bedroom back home, with a real bed frame and mattress, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a window seat overlooking the ranch. Her small trunk sat at the foot of the bed, looking pathetically inadequate in the spacious room. "Dinner is at 6, Reed said from the doorway. "You don't need to dress formally. We're not formal people here." He paused, then added, "If you need anything, Mrs. Chen will help you. I have work to do, but I'll see you at dinner." Then he left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, and Sarah was alone. She sat on the edge of the bed, soft, so much softer than her rope bed at home, and looked at the ring on her finger. The emerald caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, beautiful and foreign. Sarah Miller Reed. That was her name now. She'd saved her father's farm. She'd done the right thing, the practical thing, the necessary thing. So why did she feel like she'd just buried herself alive? Dinner was excruciating. Reed sat at the head of the long table, Sarah to his right. Mrs. Chen had prepared roast beef, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread. More food than Sarah and her father would have eaten in a week. Everything was perfectly cooked, beautifully presented, and tasted like ash in her mouth. Reed ate methodically, occasionally asking polite questions. "How was your father when you left? Have you been to this part of the territory before? Do you ride?" Sarah answered briefly. "He was fine." "No." "A little." The silences between questions stretched like canyons. She could hear every clink of silverware, every creak of the house settling. Through the window, she saw ranch hands returning from their work, heard distant laughter from the bunkhouse. Life was happening all around them, but in this dining room everything felt frozen. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Reed said suddenly. Sarah looked up, startled. "I'm not afraid." "Yes, you are. You've barely looked at me since we left the church." He set down his fork and regarded her steadily. "I meant what I said, Sarah. I won't hurt you. This arrangement doesn't require anything beyond civility and basic companionship." It was the first time he'd used her first name. Somehow, that made everything more real and more strange. "I'm not afraid," she repeated more firmly this time. "I'm just adjusting." "That's fair." He nodded once and returned to his meal. "Take whatever time you need." After dinner, Reed excused himself to his study. Apparently, he spent every evening there doing paperwork, reviewing accounts, planning the next day's work. Sarah wandered the house feeling like a ghost, haunting someone else's life. She ended up in the front room, drawn to the shelves of books. She was examining the titles, farming manuals, history books, novels by Dickens and Hawthorne, when Reed's voice came from behind her. "You're welcome to read anything you'd like." She turned to find him standing in the doorway, still wearing his formal clothes, but with his collar loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He looked more human this way, less like a statue carved from ice. "Thank you," Sarah said. "You have a lot of books. My mother insisted on education. I spent more time with tutors than ranch hands when I was young." He moved into the room, pouring himself a whiskey from a crystal decanter. She believed that owning land meant nothing if you didn't understand the world beyond your fences. She sounds remarkable. She was. Reed took a sip of his drink, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "She died when I was 19, influenza. She was healthy 1 week and gone the next." Sarah heard the grief beneath the words, old grief, carried carefully, never quite healed. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." Reed set down his glass. "I'm going to bed. I rise at 4:30. You don't need to wake that early, but breakfast is at 5 if you'd like to join me." 4:30 in the morning. Sarah had thought she woke early on the farm, but Reed's schedule was brutal. "Good night, then," she said. "Good night, wife." He said the last word carefully, as if testing how it felt. Then he left. Sarah stood alone in the grand room, surrounded by books and fine furniture and everything money could buy, and wondered if she'd made the worst mistake of her life, or if, against all logic, she might have made the best one. Only time would tell. Sarah woke to darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The mattress beneath her was too soft, the room too quiet, the air carrying unfamiliar scents, wood polish and lavender sachets instead of her father's pipe tobacco and the musty smell of old timber. Then memory crashed back. Reed Ranch, her wedding day, the emerald ring heavy on her finger. She fumbled for the oil lamp on the bedside table, struck a match, and watched the flame catch. Warm light spread across the unfamiliar room. Through the window, she could see the faintest hint of dawn, deep purple bleeding into the black sky. Somewhere below, she heard the sound of boots on hardwood floors. Reed was already awake. Sarah dressed quickly in one of her old work dresses, simple brown cotton that had seen 1,000 farm chores. Her Sunday dress hung in the wardrobe, along with the blue dress she'd worn for the wedding. That was the extent of her wardrobe. Looking at it now, in this room full of expensive furniture, she felt the gap between her old life and her new one yawning like a canyon. She braided her hair, splashed cold water on her face from the basin, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was already alive with activity. A woman Sarah hadn't met yet, the cook, presumably, worked at the massive stove, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Reed sat at the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room, reading a newspaper, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. He looked up when Sarah entered. "You're awake early." Force of habit. Sarah hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she was intruding. "Is it all right if I'm here?" "It's your house now." Reed gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, this is Mabel, our cook." "Mabel, my wife, Sarah." Mabel turned from the stove, a round woman in her 50s with flour-dusted hands and a face that looked like it smiled often. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Reed. How do you take your eggs?" "However they come," Sarah said automatically, then felt foolish. She was supposed to be the lady of the house now. Ladies probably had preferences about eggs, but Mabel just laughed, a warm sound that eased some of Sarah's tension. "A woman after my own heart. I'll make you scrambled with a bit of cheese. You look like you could use some meat on your bones." Reed returned to his newspaper. Something from Billings, Sarah noticed, dated only 2 days ago. The ranch must have its papers delivered regularly. Another small luxury that spoke to Reed's wealth. Mabel set a plate in front of Sarah that held more food than she'd typically eat for breakfast and lunch combined. Eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, 2 thick slices of bread with butter and jam. Sarah's stomach growled despite her nervousness. "What are your plans today?" Reed asked, not looking up from his paper. Sarah realized she had no idea. "I don't know. What do wives do here?" Reed finally set down the paper and met her eyes. "Whatever they want, I suppose. Mrs. Chen manages the household. Mabel handles the cooking. The cleaning girls take care of the rest. You're not required to do any of it, so I do nothing." Sarah couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "I didn't say that. I said you're not required to do it. If you want to help, I'm sure Mrs. Chen would appreciate it. If you want to read or sew or go for walks, that's fine too." He paused. "Or if you want to learn the ranch operations, Curtis can show you around." Sarah considered this while she ate. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the bacon crispy, the bread fresh-baked. Everything was better than she'd ever eaten at home, and somehow that made her feel worse rather than better. "I'd like to learn the ranch," she said finally. "If that's acceptable." Something flickered across Reed's face. Surprise, maybe, or approval. "Curtis leaves at 6. If you want to ride with him today, dress warm. It's cold in the mornings and we'll be moving cattle to the south pasture." "We?" Sarah looked at him. "You're going too?" "I work my own ranch, Sarah. I'm not the type to sit in an office and count money while other men do the labor." Reed stood, draining the last of his coffee. "If you're coming, be ready in 30 minutes. He left before she could respond. Mabel chuckled from the stove. "He's not much for conversation, that one. But he's fair, I'll give him that. Works harder than any 3 men I've ever known." Sarah finished her breakfast quickly and hurried back upstairs to change. She had 1 pair of riding pants, old, patched, decidedly unfeminine. She pulled them on, along with her thickest shirt and her father's old work jacket, which was too big but warm. She braided her hair tightly and secured it under a wool hat. When she came back downstairs, she found Reed waiting by the door, wearing his work clothes now, canvas trousers, a heavy flannel shirt, a weathered coat that had seen years of use. He looked at her outfit and nodded once. "Good, you're practical." "Come on." Curtis Webb was already at the barn, saddling horses. He was perhaps 60, with a weathered face and hands that looked like tree roots, gnarled and strong. He gave Sarah a assessing look that wasn't unfriendly, just cautious. "This is Sarah," Reed said simply. "She'll be riding out with us today. Can she ride?" Curtis asked bluntly. "I can ride," Sarah answered for herself. "Nothing fancy, but I won't fall off." Curtis cracked the smallest smile. "Fair enough. You can take Molly. She's gentle but steady." Molly turned out to be a dappled mare with kind eyes and a patient disposition. Sarah mounted carefully, feeling both men watching her. She settled into the saddle, found her stirrups, and took up the reins with hands that knew what to do even if she wasn't an expert rider. Curtis grunted approval. "She'll do." They rode out as the sun was just breaking over the mountains, painting everything gold and crimson. 4 other ranch hands joined them, men whose names Sarah didn't catch, who barely acknowledged her presence. She understood. She was the boss's wife, a complication in their simple working world. The ride to the south pasture took 40 minutes. Reed and Curtis rode ahead, discussing things in low voices, cattle counts, fence repairs, water access. Sarah followed, taking in the scope of the land. Everywhere she looked belonged to Reed. Every fence, every animal, every blade of grass. The cattle were gathered in a natural bowl between 2 hills, maybe 300 head, all Herefords with their distinctive white faces and red bodies. The ranch hands began the work of moving them, and Sarah watched how Reed operated. He didn't give orders from a distance. He was in the middle of it, working his horse expertly, cutting out stragglers, pushing the herd south toward better grazing. He moved like someone who'd been doing this his entire life, every motion efficient and purposeful. "You want to help or just watch?" Curtis appeared beside her. "Help," Sarah said immediately, "then stay on the left flank. Keep any wanderers moving with the main group. Don't push hard. These cows are pregnant, and stress isn't good for them. Just firm and steady." Sarah did as instructed. It was harder than it looked. Cattle had their own ideas about where they wanted to go, and persuading them otherwise required patience and persistence. But it was also familiar in a way nothing else at the ranch had been. This was work. This had purpose. By the time they got the herd settled in the new pasture, it was nearly noon. Sarah's legs ached from hours in the saddle, her face stung from the cold wind, and her hands were cramped from gripping the reins. She felt more alive than she had since arriving. Reed rode up beside her as they headed back. "You did well." It was the first compliment he'd given her, and Sarah felt an unexpected warmth at the words. "Thank you. Most women wouldn't have lasted an hour. I'm not most women." Sarah met his eyes. "I grew up working, Mr. Reed. I'm not afraid of it." "Jackson," he said. "What?" "My name is Jackson." "You're my wife." "You should use it." Sarah tested the name silently in her mind. Jackson. It felt intimate in a way Mr. Reed hadn't. "All right, Jackson." He nodded and rode ahead. But Sarah caught something in his expression. Approval, maybe, or something close to respect. That evening, Sarah was too exhausted to do more than eat dinner and collapse into bed. But she slept better than she had the night before, her body tired in the good way that came from useful work. The pattern repeated over the next week. She rose early, helped Mabel with breakfast, then rode out with Jackson and Curtis. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, where the water sources were, how to identify sick cattle, which fences needed repair. The ranch hands slowly stopped treating her like decoration and began treating her like someone who belonged. Evenings were still awkward. Jackson retreated to his study after dinner, and Sarah was left to her own devices. She read from his extensive library, discovering that he had surprisingly broad tastes, everything from agricultural texts to poetry. She found a worn copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, with notes in the margins, in Jackson's neat handwriting, and it surprised her. This man who seemed so controlled and practical had sat with poetry, had thought about it enough to write his reactions. On the fifth night, she was reading in the front room when Jackson emerged from his study earlier than usual. He poured himself a whiskey and settled into the chair across from her. "What are you reading?" he asked. Sarah showed him The Spine, Great Expectations by Dickens. "It's wonderful." "Have you read it?" "Twice. The second time was better." He sipped his drink. "You're adapting well. Curtis says you're a natural with the cattle." "Curtis talks?" Jackson's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Occasionally. When he's impressed." They sat in silence for a moment, but it was less strained than before, almost comfortable. "Why did you agree to this?" Jackson asked suddenly. "Really? I know you wanted to save your father's farm, but there could have been other ways. You could have left, started over somewhere else." Sarah considered the question carefully. "Because he needed it. Because watching him lose everything after losing my mother would have killed him. Because—" She hesitated. "Because staying and fighting felt better than running away." Jackson studied her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You're stronger than you look. Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation. But yes, I suppose it is." Sarah felt something shift between them, not warmth exactly, but a lowering of defenses. The beginning of something that might eventually become trust. "Why did you need a wife?" she asked, emboldened by his openness. "A man like you could have courted properly, married for better reasons than convenience." Jackson's expression shuddered slightly. "I don't have time for courtship. The ranch requires 18-hour days. And I've never been good at the things women expect. Romance, pretty words, attention." He swirled his whiskey. "I needed a partner, not a love match. Someone practical. Someone who wouldn't resent the ranch for taking all my time. So you bought one. So I married one." He met her eyes. "I didn't buy you, Sarah. I gave you a choice. Some choice. Marry you or watch my father lose everything. Better than no choice at all." Jackson stood, finishing his drink. "The world isn't fair. We both know that. But I've tried to be fair within it. I'll continue trying." He left, and Sarah sat alone with her book, but she couldn't focus on the words anymore. She kept thinking about what he'd said, about choices and fairness, and the difference between the world as it was and the world as it should be. Jackson. Reed was not a good man in the romantic sense. He'd never sweep her off her feet, or write her love letters, or make grand gestures. But he might be a fair man, an honest man, and perhaps in this harsh country, that was worth more than romance anyway. On Sunday, their first full week together complete, Jackson surprised her. "We're going to town," he announced at breakfast. "You need proper clothes. Work clothes for the ranch and a few nice dresses." Sarah looked down at her patched shirt. "These work fine. They're falling apart and winter's coming. You'll need warmer things." His tone was practical, not critical. "Besides, people will talk if I don't provide for my wife properly." So they rode to Copper Valley in the buggy, and Jackson took her to Mrs. Henderson's dress shop, a modest establishment, but the best in town. Mrs. Henderson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, looked between them with obvious curiosity. "Mr. Reed!" "And the new Mrs. Reed. What can I do for you?" "My wife needs a complete wardrobe," Jackson said bluntly. "Work clothes, everyday dresses, at least 2 formal dresses, winter coats, boots. Whatever she needs." Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up with the prospect of such a large sale. "Of course. Let me take measurements." For the next 2 hours, Sarah was measured, fitted, and paraded in front of mirrors wearing fabrics she'd never touched before. Fine wool, soft cotton, even a silk dress that made her feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Jackson sat patiently through all of it, occasionally nodding approval or suggesting more practical alternatives when Mrs. Henderson got too elaborate. When Sarah emerged in a burgundy wool dress with simple lines and minimal decoration, he said, "That one. It suits you." Sarah looked at herself in the mirror. The dress was beautiful without being fussy, elegant without being impractical. And Jackson was right, it suited her. All of it will be ready in 2 weeks. Mrs. Henderson said, tallying numbers that made Sarah's head spin. The total was more than her father's farm made in a year. Jackson paid without hesitation, peeling bills from a money clip like they meant nothing. As they left, Sarah said quietly, "You didn't have to spend so much. You're my wife. People will judge both of us by how you're dressed." He helped her into the buggy. "Besides, you work hard. You deserve decent clothes." It was such a practical reason, but delivered with something that sounded almost like kindness. On the ride home, Sarah watched the mountains turning purple in the afternoon light and realized something surprising. She didn't hate this. The work was hard, the marriage was strange, and she still felt out of place in the grand house. But there was a rhythm developing, a structure she could understand, and Jackson, for all his coldness and practicality, was keeping his promises. He was fair, he was honest, he provided for her. It wasn't love, but maybe, she thought, it could become something almost as valuable: respect, partnership, a shared purpose. Maybe that would be enough. Winter arrived in Montana with the subtlety of a hammer blow. Sarah woke on the first day of November to find the world transformed, 3 inches of snow covering everything, with more falling steadily from a sky the color of old iron. The mountains had disappeared behind white curtains, and the wind howled around the house like something alive and angry. She dressed in layers, wool stockings, her warmest work pants, 2 shirts, and her father's jacket, then made her way downstairs. Jackson was already in the kitchen with Curtis, both men looking grim. "How many are still in the high pasture?" Jackson asked. "Maybe 40 head. We should have brought them down yesterday." Curtis shook his head. "This storm came faster than the weather service predicted. Then we go get them now, before it gets worse." "Jackson, it's already bad. Visibility is maybe 50 feet. We could lose men in this. We'll definitely lose cattle if we leave them up there." Jackson's jaw was set in that stubborn line Sarah had learned to recognize. "I'm not asking anyone to go. I'll do it myself if I have to." "Like hell you will." Curtis stood. "I'll get the boys." Sarah spoke before she could think better of it. "I'm coming too." Both men turned to look at her. Jackson frowned. "No, this isn't safe. You just said you'd go alone if you had to." "That's stupider than me coming along." Sarah crossed her arms. "I know the route to the high pasture now. I've ridden it a dozen times. You need every hand you can get." "Sarah, I'm not asking permission, Jackson. I'm your wife, but I'm also a ranch hand now. You said so yourself last week." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm going." Curtis made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "She's got grit, I'll give her that." Jackson's expression was unreadable. Finally, he nodded once. "Fine, but you stay between Curtis and me at all times. If visibility drops and you can't see us, you stop immediately and call out. Understood?" "Understood. And if I tell you to turn back, you turn back. If you turn back, I'll turn back," Sarah countered. Something flickered in Jackson's eyes. Frustration, maybe, but also something that looked like pride. "Get Molly saddled. We leave in 10 minutes. The storm was worse than Sarah had imagined. The moment they left the shelter of the barn, the wind hit like a physical force, driving snow into her face, hard enough to sting. She pulled her scarf up over her nose and mouth and hunched low over Molly's neck. 6 men rode out with them: Curtis, Sarah, Jackson, and 3 ranch hands named Tom, Henry, and young Billy, who couldn't be more than 19. They moved in a tight line, each horse following the one in front, relying on instinct and memory as much as sight. The ride that usually took 40 minutes stretched to over an hour. The snow was already deep enough that the horses struggled, their breath coming in great white plumes. Sarah's fingers and toes went numb despite her gloves and boots. Her face felt frozen, every breath burning her lungs, but she kept going, keeping Molly steady behind Curtis's gelding, trusting the mare to know the way, even when Sarah couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. When they finally reached the high pasture, the cattle were huddled against the tree line, already half buried in drifts. They looked miserable, frost coating their faces, ice building on their eyelashes. Several of the younger calves were dangerously cold, barely moving. Jackson didn't waste time. "Curtis, you and Tom take the left flank. Henry, Billy, take the right. Sarah, stay with me in the rear." We push them straight down the main trail. No deviations, no stopping. If anyone falls, we all stop. Clear?" Everyone nodded. Moving 40 frightened, freezing cattle down a mountain in a blizzard was like trying to herd water uphill. They didn't want to move, and when they finally did move, they wanted to scatter in every direction except the one that would save their lives. Sarah worked her position, pushing stubborn stragglers back toward the main group, her voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. Jackson was everywhere at once, his horse cutting through the snow like it was born for this. His commands sharp and clear even in the chaos. They were halfway down when disaster struck. A massive gust of wind startled the herd, and suddenly 20 cattle broke left, crashing through the thin line of riders and heading straight toward a ravine that dropped 50 feet to a frozen creek. Billy, the youngest hand, tried to cut them off and lost control of his horse. Sarah saw him go down in a tumble of snow and thrashing hooves. Jackson was there in seconds, dismounting while his horse was still moving. He hauled Billy upright. The boy was conscious but dazed, his left arm hanging at an odd angle. The spooked cattle were still heading for the ravine. Sarah didn't think. She spurred Molly forward, racing parallel to the stampeding cattle, getting ahead of them. At the last possible second, she turned Molly broadside across their path and held her ground, making herself as large and loud as possible. The lead cow tried to stop, slipped, crashed into the cow behind it. The whole group stumbled to a halt just yards from the edge. Curtis appeared on the other side, boxing them in. "Nice work, Mrs. Reed." Sarah's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She'd just risked her life for 40 cattle and hadn't even thought twice about it. Jackson rode up, leading Billy's horse with Billy slumped in the saddle. His eyes found Sarah's, and the look he gave her was complicated. Anger, relief, something fierce that made her stomach flip. "That was reckless," he said. "That was necessary," she shot back. "You could have gone over the edge with them, but I didn't." They stared at each other while snow swirled around them, and Sarah realized with a jolt that this was the first time she'd seen Jackson genuinely shaken. Not by the storm, not by the cattle, but by what she'd done, by the risk she'd taken. He cared. Somehow, without either of them noticing, he'd started to care. "Let's get these damn cows home," he said roughly, turning away. The rest of the descent was brutal but uneventful. By the time they got the cattle into the lower pasture and secured, it was nearly dark. They rode into the barn exhausted, frozen, barely able to dismount. Mrs. Chen met them at the door with hot coffee laced with whiskey. "Billy's arm is broken," Jackson told her. "Send someone for Doc Morrison." Already done. He's waiting in the house. The men dispersed to their bunks, but Jackson caught Sarah's arm as she started to leave. "Not you. You're half frozen." "Come inside." She was too tired to argue. He led her into the house, straight to the kitchen where Mabel had soup heating and Doc Morrison was setting Billy's arm. The boy was pale and sweating, but trying not to cry. "Clean break," Doc Morrison said, a grizzled old man with gentle hands. "He'll be fine in 6 weeks." "Could have been much worse." Jackson nodded, then turned to Sarah. "Upstairs now. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." Sarah climbed the stairs on legs that felt like wood, her whole body shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. In her room, she tried to unbutton her shirt, but her fingers wouldn't work properly. They were too numb, too clumsy. A knock at the door. "And Sarah, are you changed?" "I can't get the buttons," she admitted, frustrated and embarrassed. Jackson opened the door, took one look at her, and crossed the room. His hands, still cold themselves, worked the buttons efficiently. It should have felt intimate, him undressing her, but it was purely practical, like helping an injured horse out of its tack. "Can you manage the rest?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'll have Mrs. Chen bring up hot water for a bath. You need to warm up properly." He paused at the door. "What you did today? Stopping those cattle. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen. Which do you think it was?" Sarah asked. Jackson's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before. "Both, definitely both." Then quietly, "Thank you. For coming today. For not turning back. For—" He seemed to struggle with the words. For being stronger than I expected. He left before she could respond. Sarah sank onto the bed, still shaking, and realized something had changed. The polite distance they'd maintained, the careful boundaries, those had cracked today on that frozen mountain. They'd worked together, fought together, risked together. They'd become something closer to partners. The bath Mrs. Chen prepared was hot enough to hurt, but Sarah sank into it gratefully, feeling slowly returning to her extremities. She stayed until the water cooled, then dressed in her warmest nightgown and robe, and went back downstairs. She found Jackson in his study, which she'd never entered before. He stood at the window, watching the storm, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He turned when she appeared in the doorway. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." "Can't. Too wound up." He gestured to the chair by the fireplace. "Come in if you want." Sarah entered cautiously, taking in the room. More books, a large desk covered in papers and ledgers, maps of the ranch on the walls. This was where Jackson spent his evenings, managing the empire he'd built. "Is Billy going to be all right?" she asked. "Doc says yes. He's young, he'll heal fast." Jackson refilled his glass, then poured one for Sarah without asking. He handed it to her, and their fingers brushed. Both of them noticed. "I've never had whiskey before," Sarah admitted. "Today seems like a good day to start." She sipped it carefully. It burned going down, but left a pleasant warmth in its wake. "Jackson, why did you really come after those cattle? 40 head can't be worth risking 7 people's lives." Jackson was quiet for a long moment. "My father lost 20 cattle in a blizzard when I was 10. We could have saved them, but he decided it was too dangerous, too risky. He made the practical choice." He stared into his glass. "I found their bodies in the spring. They'd huddled together for warmth, and they died that way, together. And I decided then that if I ever ran this ranch, I'd never leave an animal behind if there was any chance of saving it." Sarah heard the pain beneath the words. The weight of a childhood promise kept at great cost. "That's honorable. That's stubborn." But he said it without bitterness. "My mother used to say I cared too much about the wrong things. Animals instead of people. Land instead of relationships. Maybe you care about different things than she expected. That doesn't make them wrong." Jackson looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah felt pinned by his gaze. "You keep surprising me. I thought I was getting a desperate girl who'd do anything to save her father. But you're not desperate. You're fierce." "You keep surprising me too," Sarah admitted. "I thought I was getting a cold businessman who only cared about profit. But you risked your life today for 40 cows you could afford to lose. They're not mine to lose. They're in my care. There's a difference." Sarah understood then, in a way she hadn't before. Jackson didn't see the ranch as property he owned. He saw it as responsibility he carried. Every animal, every acre, every person who worked for him, they were all in his care, and he took that seriously. It was why he'd offered to marry her rather than simply seize her father's farm. It was why he'd spent a fortune on clothes for her. It was why he woke at 4:30 every morning and worked until dark. Not because he was greedy, but because he was responsible. "I understand you better now," she said quietly. "I'm not sure that's a good thing." But Jackson smiled when he said it, a real smile that transformed his face from stern to almost boyish. "Understanding me might make you regret marrying me. I don't regret it." The words surprised them both. Sarah hadn't meant to say them, hadn't planned them, but they were true. Standing here in this room, watching this complicated man who'd saved her father's farm and risked himself for cattle and given her purpose. When she'd felt purposeless, she didn't regret this marriage. It wasn't what she'd imagined marriage would be, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that mattered. Jackson set down his glass and crossed to where she sat. He stood looking down at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Vulnerability. "I'm not good at this," he said. "At marriage, at caring about people. I'll probably do it badly. But I want you to know—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "What happened today? Watching you out there, seeing you risk yourself, realizing you could have died." His jaw tightened. I've never been afraid like that before, and I've been through 3 blizzards worse than this one." Sarah stood, bringing them face to face. They were close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "I was afraid too. When Billy went down, when you ran toward him, I thought—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Jackson reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered against her cheek, rough and warm. "You're my wife, Sarah, not just on paper anymore. I want this to be real. It is real," she whispered. He leaned down, and this time when he kissed her, it was nothing like the brief, perfunctory kiss at their wedding. This was slow and searching, a question being asked and answered. Sarah's hands found his shoulders, steadying herself, and she kissed him back with all the confused, complicated feelings that had been building since that first day on the porch. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. "Neither do I." Sarah smiled. "We'll figure it out together." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, something warmer was beginning to grow. Something that might eventually become love, given time and patience and the courage to keep showing up, even when it was hard. They'd saved the cattle, they'd survived the storm, and now, perhaps, they could save each other from the loneliness they'd both been carrying. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, the world outside became a white void, and the ranch turned inward on itself. The men stayed in the bunkhouse, emerging only to care for the animals in the nearest barns. Mabel moved into one of the guest rooms, rather than risk the walk to her cottage. Mrs. Chen took over the household with quiet efficiency, ensuring everyone was fed and warm, and Sarah and Jackson discovered what it meant to share a life rather than just a house. They played chess. In the evenings, Jackson won the first 3 games before Sarah started to understand his strategy. By the end of the second day, she'd won twice, and the look of surprised respect on his face made her laugh for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "You're a quick study," he said. "Resetting the pieces. You're a predictable player. Once I figured out you sacrifice pawns to protect your queen." Sarah moved her knight. "You're too protective. It limits your options. Protecting what matters isn't a weakness. It is if it costs you the game." Jackson studied the board, then looked at her. "Are we still talking about chess?" Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. Since the night of the storm, something had shifted between them. They still slept in separate rooms, still maintained a careful physical distance during the day. But there were moments, brushes of hands when passing plates at dinner, lingering looks across the room. Conversations that went deeper than weather and ranch business. They were circling something neither quite knew how to name. On the 3rd night, when the wind finally died and the snow stopped falling, Jackson asked, "Would you like to see the rest of the ranch? The parts we haven't visited yet. In 3 feet of snow, the sleigh is faster than horses in this weather. And there's something I want to show you." They set out the next morning, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The sleigh was a beautiful thing, black-painted wood, with red leather seats and bells that chimed with every movement. Jackson drove, and Sarah sat beside him, wrapped in furs, watching the transformed landscape slide past. Everything was white and pristine, the snow unmarked except by animal tracks. The sunlight made the whole world glitter like it was covered in crushed diamonds. Sarah had lived in Montana her entire life, but she'd never seen it look quite like this. "Where are we going?" she asked. "The north boundary. There's a valley up there that's the best land on the whole ranch." Jackson's voice carried a note of pride. "My father bought it the year I was born. Said it would be my inheritance." They drove for an hour, climbing steadily into the foothills. Finally, Jackson pulled the sleigh to a stop at the crest of a hill and pointed down. Below them lay a perfect bowl of land, maybe 300 acres, surrounded by pines, with a frozen creek running through the center. Even buried in snow, Sarah could see its potential. The slope was gentle, the soil looked rich, and the natural shelter of the surrounding trees would protect livestock from the worst weather. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's yours." Sarah turned to stare at him. "Oh, what?" Jackson wasn't looking at her. He kept his eyes on the valley, his jaw tight. "I'm signing it over to you. 300 acres deeded in your name alone. Free and clear. Jackson, I don't understand. When we married, everything I owned became legally ours. But everything you brought became legally mine." His hands tightened on the reins. "Your father's farm, what little money you had, it all transferred to my name. That's the law. It's not fair, but it's the law." Sarah had known this, of course, but hearing him say it aloud made it real in a new way. "This valley," Jackson continued, "this is yours. If something happens to me, if you decide you can't stand being married to me, if—" He stopped, swallowed. "If you need to leave, you'll have this. Land that's worth something, security. Why would you do that?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Jackson finally looked at her, and his eyes were fierce with emotion he was trying to control. "Because you saved 40 cattle in a blizzard. Because you married me to save your father. Because you work 18-hour days and never complain. Because you're fierce and brave, and you deserve to own something that can't be taken from you." He paused, then added more quietly, "Because I want you to stay, but I need to know you're choosing to stay. Not because you're trapped, but because you want to be here." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. She'd spent her entire adult life working land she could never own, living in a house that would never be hers, building a life that belonged to her father. And now this man, this complicated, careful man she was still learning to understand, was giving her something that was entirely her own. "Jackson, you don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." He lifted the reins. "We should head back before the temperature drops," but Sarah caught his arm. "Wait." She leaned across the small space between them and kissed him. It was bold and improper and perfect, and when she pulled back, Jackson was staring at her with wonder in his eyes. "I'm choosing to stay," she said firmly. "Not because of the land? Because of you." Jackson's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Sarah Miller Reed, you're going to undo me completely." "Good," she said, and kissed him again. When they returned to the main house, Curtis was waiting with news that wiped away all the warmth of the morning. "Trouble in town," he said grimly. "Tom just rode back from Copper Valley. There's talk." Jackson's expression hardened. "What kind of talk?" "About your wife. About the marriage." Curtis glanced at Sarah apologetically. "People are saying she trapped you, that her father orchestrated the whole debt to force your hand, that she's a gold digger who seduced you into paying off worthless land." Sarah felt like she'd been slapped. "That's not—" "I know it's not true," Curtis interrupted. "Everyone who works here knows it's not true. But in town, where people don't know the real story—" He shook his head. "Mrs. Henderson has been talking. She's telling everyone about the fortune you spent on clothes, and people are drawing their own conclusions." Jackson's jaw was clenched so tight, Sarah could see the muscle jumping. "Who started this?" "Walter Gaines." The name hung in the air like poison. Sarah had heard of Walter Gaines, a neighboring rancher who'd been competing with Reed Ranch for years. He ran cattle on land adjacent to Jackson's and had apparently been trying to buy Reed property for a decade. "Of course it was Gaines," Jackson said bitterly. "He's been waiting for an excuse to undermine me since my father died." "It gets worse," Curtis said. "He's calling for a community meeting. Says there's questions about the legality of the debt transfer. He's bringing in a lawyer from Billings to review the papers. The debt was legal. The marriage is legal. Everything was properly documented." Jackson started pacing. "This is harassment, pure and simple." "Maybe so, but people are listening. And some of the smaller ranchers, the ones who owe you money," Curtis trailed off meaningfully. Sarah understood. If Gaines could cast doubt on Jackson's character, on the legitimacy of his business dealings, other debtors might try to follow suit. This wasn't just gossip, it was an attack on Jackson's reputation, and by extension his livelihood. "When is this meeting?" Jackson asked. "Saturday." 3 days from now, then we'll be there." Jackson looked at Sarah. "Both of us. We'll face this together." The next 3 days were tense. Jackson spent hours in his study, going over every document related to the debt, the marriage, the ranch's finances. He wanted to be prepared for whatever accusations Gaines threw at him. Sarah felt helpless. She'd caused this, however, inadvertently. If she hadn't agreed to marry Jackson, if her father hadn't borrowed the money, none of this would be happening. On Friday evening, she found Jackson in his study, papers spread across every surface. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "You should rest," she said from the doorway. "Can't. I need to be ready." Sarah crossed to the desk and started organizing the scattered documents. "Then let me help. Tell me what you need." Jackson looked like he might argue, then sighed. "The original loan agreement. It should be in that stack." They worked together for hours, organizing papers, reviewing contracts, preparing Jackson's defense. It was past midnight when they finally finished. "We'll be fine," Jackson said, but he didn't sound convinced. "The law is on our side. What if the law doesn't matter? What if people believe Gaines regardless of the facts? Then we deal with it." Jackson rubbed his eyes. "Sarah, I need you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever people say, I don't regret marrying you. This situation isn't your fault. It feels like my fault." "Well, it's not." He stood and crossed to where she sat. "You saved my cattle. You work harder than most men I employ. You're smarter than half the people who'll be at that meeting. And you're my wife." He took her hands. "I'm proud to stand beside you tomorrow. I need you to believe that." Sarah squeezed his hands. "I believe you. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything. You won't be. We won't let that happen." Jackson pulled her to her feet and into his arms. "We're partners now, remember? We face this together." Sarah rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, strong and steady like the man himself. "Together," she echoed. Saturday arrived cold and clear. Sarah dressed in her new burgundy dress, the one Jackson had said suited her. She braided her hair into a crown around her head, neat and respectable. She looked like a proper rancher's wife, and she needed people to see her that way. Jackson wore his black suit, the same one he'd worn for their wedding. They rode into town in the buggy, neither speaking much. The tension was thick enough to cut. The community hall was packed. It seemed like every rancher, farmer, and merchant in Copper Valley had turned out for the spectacle. Sarah saw curious faces, hostile faces, a few sympathetic ones. Her father was there, sitting in the back, his expression anguished. Walter Gaines stood at the front, a big man in his 50s, with a florid face and shrewd eyes. Next to him stood a thin man in an expensive suit, clearly the lawyer from Billings. Jackson led Sarah down the center aisle, their hands linked. Every eye in the room followed them. Sarah kept her head high, refusing to show fear even though her stomach was churning. They took seats in the front row. Jackson's hand never left hers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gaines began, his voice booming, "thank you all for coming. We're here today to discuss a matter of some importance to our community. As you all know, Jackson Reed recently married Sarah Miller under what I believe were highly irregular circumstances." "There was nothing irregular about it," Jackson said coldly. "We were married by Reverend Holbrook with proper witnesses. But the circumstances leading to that marriage, those are what concern me." Gaines gestured to the lawyer. "This is Mr. Kenneth Hardwick, an attorney from Billings. Mr. Hardwick has reviewed the documents related to Thomas Miller's debt to Reed Ranch, and he has some troubling findings." Hardwick stepped forward, papers in hand. "Based on my review, the loan terms were unusually harsh. The interest rate charged was significantly higher than standard practice. Furthermore, the contract included a clause allowing Mr. Reed to seize all assets in case of default, including assets not directly related to the loan. This suggests predatory lending practices." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt Jackson tense beside her. "The contract was standard," Jackson said, standing. "And Mr. Miller signed it willingly with full understanding of the terms." "Did he?" Gaines interjected. "Or did you take advantage of a desperate man trying to save his dying wife? And then, when he couldn't pay, did you coerce his daughter into marriage to satisfy the debt?" "That's a lie," Sarah said, standing as well. Her voice rang clear and strong through the hall. "No one coerced me. I chose to marry Jackson to save my father's farm. That was my decision made freely. A decision made under duress, Hardwick countered smoothly. When faced with her father's financial ruin, what choice did Miss Miller really have? More choice than she would have had if Reed had simply seized the farm, someone called from the back. Exactly my point, Gaines said triumphantly. Jackson Reed has been using debt as a weapon to expand his holdings and his influence. This marriage is just the most egregious example. How many other families has he trapped in similar arrangements? The crowd was getting uglier now, voices rising. Sarah saw men who owed Jackson money looking at him with new suspicion. She saw women who'd gossiped about her nodding along with Gaines' accusations. This was spiraling out of control. Then her father stood up. "That's enough," Thomas Miller said, his voice shaking but determined. "You want to know the truth? I'll tell you the truth. I borrowed money from Jackson Reed when my wife was dying. The terms were fair, more than fair. He could have charged twice the interest, and I still would have signed. When she died and I couldn't pay, Mr. Reed gave me extensions. He gave me time. He was more merciful than any bank would have been." Thomas walked down the aisle toward the front. "And when time ran out, he didn't seize my farm. He offered my daughter a way out that would save everything. Sarah chose to accept because she's strong and brave, and because Jackson Reed is a good man who deserved a good wife. Anyone who says different is calling my daughter a liar and a fool, and I won't stand for it." The hall went quiet. Thomas looked at Gaines with contempt. "You're doing this because you want Reed's land. Everyone knows it. Don't dress up your greed as concern for the community." Gaines's face turned purple. "How dare you?" "I dare because it's true." Thomas turned to address the crowd. "Jackson Reed has been nothing but fair in all his dealings. If you owe him money and can't pay, maybe ask yourself if the problem is his lending or your management." Someone in the back started clapping. Then another person joined. Within moments, half the hall was applauding Thomas's words. Jackson squeezed Sarah's hand so tight it almost hurt. But when she looked at him, she saw moisture in his eyes. Gaines tried to regain control. "This changes nothing. The legal questions remain." "There are no legal questions," Reverend Holbrook said, standing. "I performed the marriage. It was entirely proper and legal. Both parties consented freely. I would not have married them otherwise." Mrs. Chen stood next. "I work for Mr. Reed. I see how he treats his wife. With respect, with kindness. She is not a prisoner. She is a partner." One by one, people stood up. Curtis, Mabel, the ranch hands, merchants from town who'd done business with Jackson, families he'd helped during hard times. Each told their story, and the picture that emerged was nothing like the one Gaines had tried to paint. Jackson Reed wasn't a predator. He was a man who worked hard, dealt fairly, and honored his commitments. Finally, Jackson stood to speak. "Mr. Gaines, you're right about one thing. The circumstances of my marriage were unusual. But they were also honest. I needed a wife. Sarah needed to save her father. We made a practical arrangement, yes. But it's become more than that." He looked down at Sarah, and everyone in the hall could see the emotion in his eyes. "She's become my partner, my equal. Someone I respect and admire. And yes, someone I've come to love." It was the first time he'd said the word out loud. Sarah felt tears spill over. "So you can question my business practices if you want," Jackson continued. "You can call in lawyers and review contracts. You'll find everything in order. But don't insult my wife by suggesting she had no agency in her own life. She chose this. She chose me. And I'm grateful every day that she did." The hall erupted in applause. Even Gaines' supporters looked uncertain now. The lawyer gathered his papers. "Well, without evidence of actual wrongdoing, I see no grounds to proceed. The marriage appears to be legal and," he glanced at Jackson and Sarah, "genuine." Gaines glared at them with pure hatred, but he'd lost, and he knew it. He stormed out of the hall, the lawyer following. When the crowd finally dispersed, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Women she'd never spoken to welcomed her to the community. Men clapped Jackson on the back. Her father hugged her so tight she could barely breathe. "I'm proud of you," Thomas whispered. "Your mother would be proud of you too." On the ride home, Sarah leaned against Jackson's shoulder. "You said you loved me. In front of everyone." "I did." His arm came around her. I meant it. I know it's fast. I know this started as a transaction, but Sarah, I love you. Your strength, your courage, the way you face challenges head-on. You've changed everything. I love you too, Sarah said, and felt the truth of it resonate through her chest. I think I have for a while. I was just too stubborn to admit it. Jackson laughed, the sound full of relief and joy. We make quite a pair. Two stubborn people who fell in love without meaning to. The best things are unplanned, Sarah said. They drove home through the winter afternoon, past snow-covered fields and distant mountains. Two people who'd started as strangers and become partners, and were now, finally, becoming something more. Love had found them despite the odds, and they were both ready to fight for it. Winter released its grip on Montana slowly, grudgingly. By late February, the snow had retreated to the highest peaks, leaving the valley muddy and raw. The creek that ran through the property swelled with snowmelt, rushing and turbulent. Everything smelled of wet earth and possibility. Sarah woke one morning to find Jackson already gone, a note on his pillow written in his precise hand. Checking the north fence line. Back by afternoon. Jay. She smiled at the note, folded it carefully and tucked it into the drawer of her nightstand, where she kept all his notes. There were 17 of them now, some practical, some unexpectedly tender. Her favorite simply read, "Thank you for choosing me." They'd moved into the same bedroom 3 weeks after the town meeting. It hadn't been dramatic or sudden. Jackson had simply appeared at her door one evening and asked, "May I?" And Sarah had answered, "Yes," and that was that. Learning to share space with another person was strange and wonderful. Jackson was meticulous about his belongings, folding clothes with military precision. Sarah was more casual, leaving books on every surface. They'd negotiated compromises. She would keep her side of the room tidy. He would stop reorganizing her bookmarks. But the intimacy went beyond shared space. They'd learned each other's rhythms, discovered each other's vulnerabilities. Sarah knew Jackson had nightmares sometimes about his mother's death, waking in the dark, reaching for someone who wasn't there. Jackson knew Sarah feared abandonment, that some part of her still waited for him to realize he'd made a mistake. They were healing each other in ways neither had anticipated. Sarah spent the morning helping Mabel prepare for the ranch's spring gathering, an annual event where all the workers and their families came together for a meal before the intense work of calving season began. It was tradition, Jackson had explained, started by his mother and continued after her death. She believed in community, he'd said, believed that people who ate together worked better together. Sarah wanted to honor that tradition. She'd spent the last week planning the menu with Mabel, ordering supplies, preparing the main house for guests. It would be her first time hosting as mistress of Reed Ranch, and she was determined to do it right. "You're going to wear yourself out," Mabel warned, as Sarah kneaded bread dough for the 4th time that morning. "We've got enough food to feed an army. I want it to be perfect. It will be perfect because you made it, not because you killed yourself making it." Mabel covered the rising dough with a cloth. "Go take a break. Walk Reed, do something that isn't work." Sarah wiped flour from her hands and decided Mabel was right. She grabbed her coat and headed outside. The ranch was busy with midday activity. Curtis was working with a young colt in the training pen, teaching it to accept a saddle. 2 hands were mending the fence around the chicken coop. Lucy and Emma were hanging laundry that snapped and billowed in the wind like white flags of surrender. Sarah found herself drawn toward the barn, toward the horses. Molly nickered when she appeared, hoping for treats. Sarah obliged with an apple from her pocket. "You're spoiling her." Sarah turned to find a woman standing in the barn entrance, someone she'd never seen before. She was perhaps 30, beautiful in a sharp-edged way, with copper-colored hair and green eyes that assessed Sarah with barely concealed hostility. "I'm sorry. Can I help you?" Sarah asked. "I doubt it." The woman stepped forward. "I'm Victoria Gaines, Walter's daughter." Sarah's hand tightened on the apple. "What are you doing here?" "Visiting. Jackson and I are old friends." "Didn't he tell you?" Victoria's smile was all teeth. "Of course he didn't. Men are terrible at mentioning their past attachments." "Attachment?" Sarah kept her voice level despite the knot forming in her stomach. "We were engaged. 3 years ago, before his mother died." Victoria examined her gloved hands. "Everyone expected us to marry. Our family's ranches would have joined, creating the largest operation in the territory. But then his mother got sick and Jackson broke things off. Said he couldn't think about marriage while she was dying. After she passed, he just never came back to me." Sarah didn't know what to say. Jackson had never mentioned an engagement, never talked about past relationships. She'd assumed there had been some. He was a handsome, wealthy man, but she'd never imagined something this serious. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because you should know what kind of man you married. He's cold, Sarah, calculating. He chose duty over love once, and he'll do it again." Victoria moved closer. "Your marriage is just another business transaction to him. He needed a wife, you needed money. Don't fool yourself into thinking it's more than that. You don't know anything about our marriage. I know Jackson Reed. I know he doesn't let people in, doesn't let himself feel anything that might interfere with his precious ranch." Victoria's eyes glittered. "You're convenient. When you stop being convenient, he'll discard you just like he discarded me." "I think you should leave," Sarah said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I'm just trying to help." Woman to woman, Victoria headed toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Sarah, my father isn't done fighting. The meeting didn't go his way, but he has other strategies. You might want to prepare yourself. This isn't over." She left, and Sarah stood alone in the barn, her mind reeling. Jackson returned just after 2, looking tired but satisfied. "North fence is secure. We should be ready for calving season." He kissed Sarah's cheek, a gesture that had become routine and precious. "How was your morning?" Sarah almost told him about Victoria's visit. The words were right there, ready to spill out, but something held her back. Pride, maybe, or fear. Fear that Victoria was right, that Jackson was still holding parts of himself back. "Fine," she said instead. "Busy. The preparations for tomorrow are almost done." Jackson studied her face. "You're upset. What happened?" "Nothing. I'm just tired." "Sarah," he took her hands. "Don't do that. Don't shut me out, like you shut me out about Victoria Gaines." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Jackson went very still. "She was here. Yes, she told me about your engagement. About how you broke it off." Sarah pulled her hands away. "Were you ever going to tell me?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "It was years ago. It's not relevant." "Not relevant." "Jackson, you were engaged to another woman. You almost married her. That seems pretty relevant to me." "It was a mistake. My father wanted the match. Her father wanted it. Everyone wanted it except me." Jackson ran a hand through his hair. "I agreed because it made sense on paper, joining the properties, strengthening both families. But I didn't love her. I never loved her. Then why not tell me? Why keep it secret?" "Because it's in the past, and I didn't want it touching what we have." Jackson's voice rose slightly. "Because Victoria is vindictive and manipulative, and I knew if you ever met her, she'd try to poison your mind against me." Which apparently she did. Sarah wanted to argue, but she could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't hiding the relationship out of shame or continued feeling. He'd been trying to protect what they'd built together. "She said you're cold," Sarah said quietly. "That you chose duty over love. That I'm just convenient." "And you believed her?" Jackson's expression was wounded. "No. But Jackson, sometimes you are distant. Sometimes I feel like there are parts of you I can't reach." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I need to know that this is real. That I'm not just another practical decision." Jackson closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands. "Look at me, Sarah. Really look at me." She did. She saw frustration, yes, but also fear. Fear that matched her own. "You are not convenient," Jackson said fiercely. "You're terrifying. You make me feel things I've spent my whole life avoiding, because feeling meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant weakness. My mother loved my father so much that when he died, part of her died too. I watched her fade, watched her lose herself in grief. And I promised myself I'd never let anyone have that much power over me." His hands were shaking slightly. "But then you came into my life, and you were so strong, so brave, and I thought I could keep it simple, keep it safe. Except you saved cattle in a blizzard, and you stood up to gossips, and you looked at me like I was worth something beyond my bank account. And now I'm in so deep that losing you would destroy me." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "Jackson, I'm terrified, Sarah. Every day I'm terrified that you'll realize you deserve better than a man who doesn't know how to say 'I love you' without it sounding like a business report. But I do love you. I love you more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. And if that makes me vulnerable, then so be it." Sarah kissed him, tasting salt from her tears and his. When they finally pulled apart, she pressed her forehead to his. "I'm terrified too. Every day I'm afraid this is too good to be true, that I'll wake up and you'll realize I'm just a farm girl who got lucky. But we have to trust each other. No more secrets, no more protecting each other from the past. We face everything together. Agreed?" "Agreed." Jackson pulled her close. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about Victoria. You're right, you should have known, and I'm sorry I doubted you." Sarah breathed in the scent of him, horse and leather and home. "We're both still learning how to do this. We'll learn together." He kissed the top of her head. "Besides, you're stuck with me now. You own 300 acres of my land. That's commitment." Sarah laughed despite herself. "Is that your way of being romantic?" "I'm working on it." Jackson smiled against her hair. "Give me time. I'll get better at this." The spring gathering the next day was a resounding success. Over 60 people crowded into and around the main house, ranch hands and their families, neighboring farmers, townspeople who'd supported them during the meeting. Tables groaned under the weight of food: roasted beef, Mabel's famous potato salad, fresh bread, pies made from preserved fruit. Sarah moved through the crowd, making sure everyone had enough to eat, introducing herself to wives she hadn't met, playing with children who ran shrieking through the yard. She felt Jackson's eyes on her often, warm and proud. Thomas arrived mid-afternoon, looking healthier than Sarah had seen him in years. The farm was doing well now that the debt was cleared, and he'd hired a young man from town to help with the work. "You look happy," he said, hugging Sarah. "I am," and she meant it. Despite Victoria's visit, despite the lingering fears, she was genuinely happy. As evening approached, Jackson stood on the porch and raised his glass. "I want to thank everyone for coming. This ranch has been my life since I was born, but it's never felt like a home until recently." He looked at Sarah. "My wife has brought something here that was missing: warmth, community, the kind of generosity my mother would have loved. So here's to Sarah, and to all of you who make this place worth working for." Everyone cheered and drank. Sarah felt her cheeks burning, but she also felt something else: belonging. This was her community now. These were her people. Curtis stood next, his weathered face serious. "I've worked this ranch for 23 years, seen Mr. Reed grow from a boy to a man, and I'll tell you straight, he's never been happier than he's been these last few months. That's because of Mrs. Reed. She's one of us now, a real ranch woman. So here's to the boss and his lady. May they have many years together." More cheers, more toasts. By the time the last guests departed, Sarah was exhausted but glowing. She and Jackson stood on the porch, watching the final wagon disappear down the road. The spring evening was cool but not cold, smelling of new grass and possibility. "Your mother would have liked this," Sarah said. "She would have loved you." Jackson pulled her into his arms. "Strong, practical, kind. Everything she valued. I wish I could have met her. She would have told you that I'm stubborn and difficult, and you should be prepared for a lifetime of arguing." Jackson smiled. "She would have been right. I can handle stubborn and difficult." Sarah tilted her face up to kiss him. "I married you, didn't I?" "Best decision I ever made," Jackson murmured against her lips. "Offering you that choice. Best decision I ever made." Accepting it, they stood together as darkness fell. Two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way and built something real from what should have been merely practical. Spring was here. The hardest season on a ranch, carving, branding, endless work from dawn until dark. But they would face it together, as partners in every sense of the word, and whatever challenges came, whether from vindictive neighbors or their own fears, They would face those together too, because they'd learned the most important lesson. Love wasn't about perfect romance or grand gestures. It was about showing up every day and choosing each other, over and over again. It was about trust earned slowly, painfully, honestly. It was about two stubborn people learning to be vulnerable, and they were both ready for that challenge. That night, lying in their shared bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Sarah whispered, "Jackson, are you awake?" Yes. Tell me something you've never told anyone else." He was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. "Then sometimes I talk to my mother, out in the fields when I'm alone. I tell her about the ranch, about decisions I'm making. I ask her advice, even though I know she can't answer." Sarah rolled over to face him. "That's not foolish. That's love. I tell her about you now, about how you're making this place feel like home again." Jackson's hand found hers in the darkness. "I think she sends me signs sometimes. A hawk flying overhead when I'm struggling with something. The way the light hits the mountains at certain moments. Small things that feel like her saying she's still watching, still proud. I'm sure she is proud of the man you've become, of what you've built, of what we've built," Jackson corrected. "You're part of this now, Sarah, part of everything." Sarah moved closer, fitting herself against his side. "Tell me something else. Something happy from your childhood," and Jackson did. His voice soft in the darkness, telling her about summers spent riding with his father, about his mother teaching him to read, using books of poetry, about the first time he successfully trained a horse on his own. Sarah listened, learning him, loving him more with every story. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and star-filled. The ranch slept peacefully, and inside, two people who'd started as strangers continued the slow, beautiful work of becoming one. April arrived with a vengeance, bringing the chaos of calving season. For 3 weeks straight, Sarah and Jackson barely slept. They took shifts, checking the pregnant cows, assisting difficult births, warming chilled newborns by the fire. Sarah's hands became permanently stained with iodine and blood. Her back ached from hours spent kneeling in straw. But every time a calf stood on wobbly legs and found its mother's milk, she felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. This was ranching at its most fundamental, life continuing despite the odds. Because people cared enough to help it along. One morning, exhausted after a particularly difficult delivery, Sarah stumbled back to the house to find a telegram waiting. Her father's handwriting, shaky but urgent. "Come quick, important. Not emergency, but soon." Jackson found her standing in the kitchen, telegram in hand, worry creasing her forehead. "What's wrong?" "My father needs me. He says it's not an emergency, but..." Sarah bit her lip. "I should go, then we'll go together." Jackson was already moving toward the door. "Curtis can handle things here for a day." They rode out within the hour, the spring morning bright and promising. The ride to the Miller farm took them through transformed landscape. Everything green and alive, wildflowers carpeting the meadows, newborn calves dotting the pastures. When they arrived, Thomas was waiting on the porch, and to Sarah's surprise, he was smiling. Not the strained, worried smile she'd grown accustomed to, but a genuine expression of joy. "What's happened?" Sarah asked, dismounting quickly. "Are you all right?" "I'm more than all right." Thomas gestured them inside. "I have news. Good news for once." The farmhouse looked different, cleaner, better maintained. Fresh curtains hung in the windows. The furniture had been repaired. Even the air smelled different, carrying the scent of bread baking rather than the musty staleness Sarah remembered. "The farm is doing well," Thomas began, settling into his chair. "Better than it has in years. The wheat came in strong, the garden is producing, and I've been selling eggs and butter in town. I'm actually making money again." "That's wonderful, Papa," Sarah said, though she still didn't understand the urgency. Thomas took a deep breath. "I want to pay back the debt. The full amount, $1,500 plus interest. I've been saving every penny, and I'm almost there. Another month, maybe 2, and I'll have it all." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Papa, you don't have to." "I do have to." Thomas looked at Jackson. "You were generous beyond measure, Mr. Reed." You gave me time I didn't deserve, and when I couldn't pay, you found a way to settle things that saved my farm and gave my daughter a good life. But the debt has weighed on me. I need to pay it, to clear it properly, to know I stood by my obligations." Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Miller, the debt is already settled. You don't owe me anything. The debt is settled because I traded my daughter for it," Thomas said bluntly. "That's not the same as paying what I owe. I want to do this right. Please, let me have my dignity back." Sarah saw the emotion working in Jackson's face. Respect, understanding, something deeper. Finally, Jackson nodded. "All right. When you have the full amount, we'll consider the original debt officially repaid. But Mr. Miller," he paused, "I didn't marry Sarah to settle a debt. I married her because I needed her, and I'd do it again, even if you'd never borrowed a penny from me." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "I know that now. Anyone can see how you two look at each other. But let me do this anyway. For myself." After they left, riding back toward Reed Ranch, Sarah was quiet. Jackson finally asked, "What are you thinking?" "That my father's a proud man. That pride isn't always a weakness." Sarah looked at the mountains rising in the distance. "And that everything has come full circle. The debt that brought us together will be paid, but we'll still be together because we choose to be." Jackson reached across and took her hand. "We'll always choose each other." 2 weeks later, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a while. The morning nausea, the exhaustion that went beyond the demands of ranch work, the tenderness in her breasts. But when Dr. Morrison confirmed it, the reality hit her like a thunderbolt. She was going to be a mother. She told Jackson that evening on their porch. The same porch where they'd sat so many times, watching the sun set over the mountains. He'd been reading reports about cattle prices, and she simply said, "Jackson, I'm pregnant." He went completely still. The papers slipped from his hands, scattering in the evening breeze. "You're... what? Pregnant? About 2 months along. Dr. Morrison confirmed it this afternoon." For a long moment, Jackson just stared at her. Then his face transformed. Fear, joy, wonder all at once. "Sarah, my God, Sarah." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "Are you happy?" "I mean, I know we didn't plan." "I'm terrified," Sarah admitted. "But yes, I'm happy." "Are you?" Jackson's voice broke. "I'm going to be a father. We're going to have a child. Family?" He laughed, the sound half-sob. "I never let myself imagine this. Never thought I deserved it. You deserve it. We both do." Sarah took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're building something here, Jackson. Not just a ranch, but a legacy. A family." That night, lying in bed, Jackson's hand never left her stomach. "Tell me about your childhood," he said. "I want to know everything. I want to know what kind of mother you'll be." So Sarah told him about helping her mother in the garden, about learning to cook and sew, about the stories her mother used to tell. And Jackson told her about his own childhood, about the lessons his mother had taught him about kindness and responsibility. They talked until dawn, planning a future that had seemed impossible 6 months ago, but their happiness was interrupted by one final challenge. Walter Gaines hadn't given up. Unable to discredit Jackson through legal means, he'd turned to more direct tactics. Fences on Reed property started mysteriously breaking. Cattle were driven onto neighboring land, causing disputes with other ranchers. Tools disappeared from barns. Small fires broke out in hay storage. Curtis brought the latest incident to Jackson's attention. 20 head of cattle missing from the east pasture. They didn't wander off. Someone drove them through a cut fence. This was deliberate. Jackson's expression was grim. "Gaines. Can't prove it, but yeah, probably." Curtis spat into the dirt. "Man's determined to ruin you. He's not going to succeed." Jackson turned to Sarah, who'd been listening. "Stay close to the house. I don't trust him not to escalate." But Sarah shook her head. "No, we face this together, remember? That was our promise." The confrontation came 3 days later. Sarah was riding the southern boundary alone, against Jackson's wishes. But she'd argued that she needed to maintain her independence when she found Walter Gaines on Reed property. "Cutting fence wire, Mr. Gaines," she said, keeping Molly steady. "You're trespassing." Gaines turned and his face twisted with contempt. "Mrs. Reed, how convenient. I've been meaning to talk to you." "Then talk. After you put down the wire cutters. Your husband ruined my plans to expand my ranch. Cost me a fortune in legal fees with that sham meeting. Now he's going to pay. By sabotaging his property? That's criminal. Prove it." Gaines stepped toward her horse. "You're in my way, Mrs. Reed, you and your husband both. This valley isn't big enough for Reed Ranch to keep growing." Molly shifted nervously. Sarah kept her voice calm. "So your answer is destruction? Theft? What kind of man are you?" "The kind who gets what he wants." Gaines reached for Molly's bridle. Sarah pulled back, but Gaines grabbed the reins. Molly reared and Sarah felt herself sliding. Then suddenly Jackson was there, seemingly appearing from nowhere, pulling Gaines away from the horse with such force the older man stumbled. "Touch my wife again, and I'll break your arm," Jackson said, his voice deadly quiet. Curtis appeared behind him, along with 3 ranch hands. They must have been tracking Gaines, waiting for proof of his sabotage. "You're trespassing, Gaines. You're destroying property. We have witnesses." Jackson gestured to the cut fence. "That's enough to press charges." For the first time, Gaines looked uncertain. "You can't prove—" "We can prove everything. Curtis has been documenting every incident. We have dates, locations, evidence." Jackson's smile was cold. "You wanted to destroy me, but you were sloppy. And now you're done." The sheriff arrived within the hour. Curtis had sent for him that morning when they'd spotted Gaines entering Reed property. The evidence was overwhelming. Walter Gaines was arrested for trespassing, vandalism, and theft. As the sheriff led him away, Gaines shouted, "This isn't over, Reed." "Yes," Jackson said quietly, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "It is." Victoria Gaines came to the ranch 1 week later. She stood on the porch, looking diminished somehow, smaller, less threatening. "I came to apologize," she said without preamble. Sarah, who'd answered the door, was too surprised to speak. "My father's actions. I didn't know how far he'd go. I knew he resented Jackson, but I never imagined—" Victoria trailed off. "What I said to you in the barn was cruel and false. Jackson isn't cold. He's careful with his heart. But when he loves completely. I know that now. I knew it then, actually. I just couldn't admit it." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because you deserve to know the truth. And because I'm leaving. Going east, away from this valley and everything that reminds me of what I lost." Victoria managed a sad smile. "Take care of him, Sarah. He's a better man than most people realize." She left and Sarah watched her ride away, feeling something like pity. Victoria had spent years holding on to bitterness, and it had poisoned her life. Sarah was grateful she'd chosen a different path. Thomas Miller paid his debt in full on a bright June morning. He rode to Reed Ranch with a leather satchel containing $1,640 in cash, every penny earned through months of hard work and careful saving. Jackson counted it out on his desk, then wrote "paid in full" across the original loan document and handed it to Thomas. "We're even," Jackson said, shaking Thomas's hand. "No," Thomas replied. "I owe you more than money could ever repay. You gave me back my dignity, gave my daughter a good life, and you're about to make me a grandfather. I'd say you're ahead." They shared lunch together that day, Thomas, Sarah, and Jackson, talking about the farm, the ranch, the baby coming in October. Thomas looked younger somehow, the weight of debt lifted from his shoulders. As he prepared to leave, he pulled Sarah aside. "Your mother would be so proud of you. The woman you've become, the life you've built. I know I've told you before, but I need you to hear it again. You made the right choice that day. The brave choice." "It didn't feel brave at the time," Sarah admitted. "The best choices rarely do." Thomas kissed her forehead. "Be happy, my girl. You've earned it." Sarah and Jackson's daughter was born on October 15th, during the first snow of autumn. The labor was long and difficult. Jackson paced the hallway outside their bedroom, while Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Chen attended Sarah. Curtis had to physically restrain him twice from bursting into the room. Finally, near dawn, the thin wail of an infant split the air. Jackson was through the door before Mrs. Chen could announce it was safe. Sarah lay exhausted against the pillows, her hair sweat-dampened, her face pale. But she was smiling, and in her arms was the smallest, most perfect creature Jackson had ever seen. "Your daughter," Sarah said softly. Jackson sat carefully on the edge of the bed, staring at the tiny face. "She's beautiful." "She's perfect, Margaret," Sarah said. "After your mother." "If that's all right," Jackson couldn't speak. He could only nod, tears streaming freely down his face as he touched one gentle finger to his daughter's impossibly small hand. Margaret's fingers curled around his, gripping with surprising strength. "She's strong," he managed. "Like her mother. And stubborn, probably. Like her father." Sarah leaned against him. "We made her, Jackson. We made this perfect thing." They sat together as the sun rose, three people who were now a family, watching the Montana dawn paint everything gold. The years that followed were good ones. Reed Ranch prospered under the partnership of Jackson and Sarah. They expanded carefully, always mindful of sustainability rather than pure profit. They became known throughout the territory as fair employers, innovative ranchers, and pillars of their community. Margaret grew into a spirited child with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determination. 2 years later, a son arrived, Thomas, named for Sarah's father. Then another daughter, Catherine, who completed their family. The valley that had once been divided by debt and suspicion became a place of cooperation. Other ranchers followed the Reeds' example of fair dealing and community investment. Copper Valley grew from a struggling frontier town into a thriving community. Sarah's 300 acres, the land Jackson had given her, became a place of pilgrimage for the family. Every anniversary, they'd ride out to that valley and spend the day there, remembering how far they'd come. Thomas Miller lived to see all 3 grandchildren, dying peacefully at 73, with Sarah holding his hand. The Miller farm passed to a young family who struggled, and Jackson bought their debt, then immediately forgave it, with only one condition, that they work it honestly and pass on the same generosity someday. Walter Gaines spent 2 years in prison and emerged a broken man. His ranch failed, his daughter never returned from the East, and he died alone. Jackson paid for his funeral anyway, because Sarah insisted that mercy mattered even for those who'd shown none. On their 10th anniversary, Sarah and Jackson stood on their porch watching the sunset, a ritual they'd maintained through illness, exhaustion, joy, and sorrow. Their children played in the yard, their voices carrying on the evening air. "Do you remember that first day?" Sarah asked, leaning into Jackson's embrace. "When you rode up to collect a debt and rode away with a wife, I remember thinking you were the most stubborn woman I'd ever met." Jackson kissed the top of her head. "I had no idea how much I needed someone exactly that stubborn. It wasn't supposed to be like this," Sarah mused. "We weren't supposed to fall in love. The best things are the ones we don't plan." Jackson turned her to face him. "You saved me, Sarah. Not from debt or loneliness, but from living a half-life. From being so afraid of feeling that I never really lived at all. You saved me, too. From believing I had to be small to be safe. From thinking practical meant loveless." Sarah reached up to touch his face, now marked with lines that told the story of their years together. "We saved each other. We did." Jackson pulled her closer. "And we're not done yet. We have years ahead. Children to raise, grandchildren to spoil, this ranch to run into the ground with our stubbornness." Sarah laughed. "You promise?" "I promise. I came to collect a debt and found my entire life instead. I'm not letting that go." They kissed as the sun dipped below the mountains. 2 people who'd built love from the most unlikely materials, desperation and duty, transformed by choice and courage into something that would last generations. Inside the house, the children called for them. Dinner was waiting. Life was waiting. They walked inside together, hand in hand, ready for whatever came next, because they'd learned the most important lesson. Love isn't about the dramatic beginning or the perfect circumstances. It's about showing up every day and choosing each other. Over and over again, it's about 2 stubborn people who were brave enough to believe that something beautiful could grow from broken ground. And it had. Oh, how it had. 70 years later, the Reed Ranch still stands, one of the oldest continuously operated family ranches in Montana. It's run now by Margaret's great-granddaughter, a fierce woman who inherited her ancestors' stubbornness and heart. In the main house, in a place of honor above the fireplace, hangs a portrait. A young couple, stern-faced but with laughter in their eyes. Jackson Reed and Sarah Miller Reed, painted on their 5th anniversary. Below the portrait, in a glass case, sits a leather-bound journal, Sarah's diary, and started the day she arrived at the ranch and continued until 3 months before her death at 91. It's been transcribed and published, becoming a minor classic of frontier literature. The final entry reads simply, "Jackson died in his sleep last night, with me beside him, and our children gathered around. He was 98. We had 68 years together. Not long enough, but a lifetime nonetheless. I'll join him soon. The debt is paid. The love remains. That's all that matters." She died 2 weeks later in the same bed, holding the emerald ring he'd given her on their wedding day. They're buried on the hill, overlooking the valley, the 300 acres that had been Sarah's alone. Now part of the larger ranch, but still marked on all the maps as Sarah's Valley. Their story lives on in the land they worked, the family they built, and the legacy they left, proof that love can grow anywhere, even in the hardest soil, as long as there are 2 people brave enough to plant it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.